Hello and welcome. I'm Teferra Gadamu. As part of a global movement, a number of institutions have joined hands in organizing 16 days of activism against gender-based violence in Ethiopia. Well, how bad is that form of violence in this country? My guest today, Sehin Teferra, one of the founders of setaweet feminist movement, says it is on the increase. Very worrying indeed. A very warm welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me.
When was it? This past Sunday or on Monday, you started observing the 16 days of activism against gender-based violence. Not only in Ethiopia, it's a worldwide event that started in 1991, right? And your organization, setaweet, was established 4+ years ago. And you very well, you merged very well with that whole concept of activism against gender-based violence. What is this all about? And what are you trying to address? And we all know what gender-based violence means, definitely, but there's a cultural thing too.
Definitely.
Where do you draw the line between what is gender-based violence and what is not?
So the 16 Days of Activism, because not everybody might know it, like you said, it was started in 1991. It's a global movement now. And it marks 16 days from the beginning, which is November 25th until December 10th. And these days are unique because within them you have many days of commemoration. You have the Day Against HIV/AIDS, which is December 1st. You have the Day of People with Disabilities, which is December 3rd, and it ends on December 10th, which is the Day for Human Rights. So it was planned to kind of span these days. November 25th is the Day of Elimination of Gender-Based Violence. So those 16 days are when we're most active addressing different aspects of gender-based violence. In Ethiopia, you're right. It's very complicated, and you said we know what gender-based violence is, but I'm not sure everybody does. It's actually really quite hard to define. It's used synonymously with violence against women because almost always it's women who are victimized. It's not to say men are not victimized, but the vast majority of victims and survivors are women and girls. Because it has to do with the gender, which is a power construct. Women and girls in general are weaker in power and physical strength, and money and independence, and the values given to them by society. Therefore, they're more vulnerable to violence. So that's what we mean by gender-based violence. In terms of your question, how it relates to culture and traditions, it's very difficult. And luckily, the activists and the generation that's come before us have done a good job of making it very clear that some things that have been excused in the past as culture or tradition are indeed forms of violence. Three classic cases are abduction for marriage, talafa in Amharic. So a big aspect of Ethiopian culture, in all Ethiopian cultures, and particularly some ethnic groups. And this was dismissed not as a form of violence, but as culture, as tradition. But in the last 2-3 decades, and because of the activism of organizations such as Ethiopian Women Lawyers Association, this has been criminalized. So now, yes, we do consider it.
It's a disappearing practice, right?
It's not. It's actually a myth that it's disappearing. It's reduced in some areas, but in other areas we actually see a resurgence. We even hear of cases of abduction in Addis, which was actually unheard of. So it goes in waves, and we would actually say gender-based violence in general is increasing, is on the increase. That's definitely our experience, it's definitely our observation. And also similarly with these traditional forms of gender-based violence. So I think we can call them traditional forms of violence. They're still violence. Other forms are female genital cutting. Again, not considered violence in the past, criminalized now. Again, thanks to our government's attention to it, and particularly the work of the Ministry of Health, but definitely the activism of EULA and other organizations that have preceded us. Again, it's a tradition. Women and mothers have done it for centuries, not realizing it's a form of violence, but we do recognize it as violence now. Third form of traditional violence, a traditional form of gender-based violence is early marriage. It used to be called early marriage. Now it's called child marriage, which is what it should be. It's a crime. It's a crime against the girls. damages their psyche, it damages their health, it damages their potential, takes them out of school. Again, it's very clear, the government and our legislation is very clear that this is a form of violence. The age of marriage is now 18. So where we draw the line is it's been clarified. These are all forms of violence. So when we talk about traditional forms of violence, they are an aspect of gender-based violence, but now we have other forms that are not necessarily traditional, and they appear more in urban areas, rape in particular, rampant now. I would say it's at a crisis level. And other forms of violence that weren't even in consideration when the criminal code was being codified 20-something years ago. So acid attacks in particular. There's no law against acid attacks because they didn't exist when the law is being codified. And I think we'll talk a little bit about this. I think you'll ask me. But that's part of our work on the activism front, is to have these taken seriously now as a different, as an emerging form of violence that should be addressed by the law.
Why are all these forms of violence on the increase? I mean, you said there is so much activism going on as we speak. I see a contradiction there, don't you see?
I wouldn't say there's a lot of activism. Activism has actually really, I wouldn't say it's died down, but it's really been cut back. So everything I've said about the work of EULA, that was in tribute to the work that they did 20 years ago, 15 years ago, 10 years ago. Activism now it's been very much weakened.
Why is that weakened?
A lot of it because of the legislation against NGOs. That's being discussed right now. I think currently, as we speak, in the Parliament, the law will be lifted. It is hoped. But the fact is that a lot of the work that's gone before, in terms of gender violence, in terms of gender activism, but also other work, on the environment and human rights, the activism, the reality is that it's been funded by NGOs and by foreign funding. And as you know, that was curtailed 7 years ago, when the law stipulating that in order to do activism in Ethiopia, you have to raise your funds locally. That's made it impossible for NGOs to work on this.
I see on that. I can see your point on the NGO front, but you have women's associations all the way down to the Warada level, who've been active for years. Didn't they make any difference in the whole drive to? I
wouldn't say they haven't made a difference. They've made a big difference. But if you're talking about women's associations, and you're absolutely right, they do exist all the way down to the Warada level, highly centralized. They command membership in the millions, like the Amara Women's Association or the Oromo Women's Associations. If you look at them, they can mobilize women within hours in the millions. They have a lot of strength. I would say they have a lot of potential. Have they always used it to their full potential? No, I don't think so. And I hope that will change now with the liberalization.
Why do you think they haven't used it to the full?
It's really hard for me to comment as an outsider. A lot of it has to do with the fact that they're very strongly affiliated to political parties. That is the reality. They're meant to be independent, but we haven't always found them to be independent. So it's not to say that they don't do their work. They certainly do. I've been to very, very...
But I mean, the issues that you just mentioned, the gender-based violence, all those forms of violence you just mentioned, do not necessarily have to be, you don't have to necessarily be a politically oriented to be able to address those.
Yes, the women's associations, they've done a lot of good. When we look at, for example, the reduction in infant mortality, the reduction in maternal mortality, a lot of the credit can go to that, to the centralized nature of our government, and certainly to the Health Development Army. So definitely they've done a lot of good. But I think a problem with that question is that we see this as a separate issue. It's not, if it's a human rights issue, it's the government that should be questioned. It's the police. Unfortunately, we still have the habit of going to the women's associations or to the Women's Affairs Bureau with all forms of injustice against women, and that's actually a misunderstanding of the role. The ministry is charged with mainstreaming gender across the stream. It's charged with mainstreaming gender in all the ministries. Its job is not to follow up cases of violence. That's the job of the police. If it's a crime, then it's the job of the police. It's the job of the Human Rights Commission. Unfortunately, violence against women is not a central issue. That's part of that's exactly the core issue. And for me, that's because women are treated as second-class citizens. Their issues are treated separately. If a man is violated, he goes to the police as a first class citizen. He doesn't go to a specially designated place for men. And that's part of the response of the system, I think. And I think we were hoping with the new liberalization of our political system that some of this will change. It doesn't seem so far, but that's definitely part of the problem. But even when you go to the police, they're really overwhelmed with sexual violence cases, and the police, they're made up of men and women in uniform. They're made up of the same society. A lot of them are the ones who perpetuate violence against women. We know of many cases where policemen have raped women, or they victim blame, they victim shame. So it's been really hard to get a response that way. But apart from that, I would really say there's a crisis in how women are treated and valued in Ethiopian society.
You just raised a very important point. That's why I believe such cases are underreported, right?
They're definitely underreported, not just in Ethiopia, but in the world. In Ethiopia, we don't have the data to know. But even in the West, in some countries where they keep very detailed reports, they say only 3% of all rape is reported. So you can imagine for Ethiopia, it's definitely much less. But even the numbers that are reported, they're not always treated well. The women are blamed. They're shamed by the police. Sometimes they start the process and they end up dropping the case because they're coerced by the rapists. Or sometimes it's elders in the family, the shimgilina system that's so unfair to women. Women are asked to drop the cases because the man will recompensate the family, or other cases, or coerced outright. I'll hurt your family if you report, that kind of thing.
Setaweet movement, it's a feminist movement. You are brutally honest about that, and you want to stop short of achieving your objectives, your mission. I mean, making men non-violent, right? That's what you're going.
Making men non-violent, yeah, that sounds. I don't think you've seen that anywhere in any of our material. I don't think we're concerned with making anybody anything. We are honest in that this is a feminist movement, and what that means is a commitment to equality, a commitment to fighting for gender equality, because feminism is wildly misunderstood in Ethiopia. A lot of the time, I think, willfully.
Why is it misunderstood, you think?
I think we have a phobia of things that come from the West, which is a little bit ironic because we like democracy. It's a Western concept. All our education system, our health system, our justice system, everything, the way the country runs is 100% copy-pasted from other countries. And yet when it comes to feminism, people kind of balk at that. And for me, that's really it's a very lazy excuse to not engage with it. And I think what it is people are just uncomfortable with the idea that the way gender works currently is not working, and we all have to change. And that's women and men. It's not just men. It's not just men. So it's a commitment to equality, but it's an Ethiopian movement. Are we influenced by the West? No doubt. But all our principles are Ethiopian. Our working language is Amharic, Afan Oromo and Tigrinya. And it's based on Ethiopian understandings. We do our best to learn from the activism that's come before us. We don't claim to create Ethiopian feminism. It existed long before we came along. But we try to articulate what it means currently. For me personally, I always say I learned feminism from my grandmother. Does she know the word feminist? No, probably not. But she taught me what it means to respect myself as a woman and to stand up for other women and to fight for equality. And that's really all feminism is. Are we interested in making men accountable? Yes. We think men should be accountable for their acts, but so should women. And patriarchy hurts both men and women. And we have a lot of really very active, very articulate men within our movement. And we leave it to them to engage with men. It's not for me to tell men what to do. I speak for myself. And the men within our movement speak for themselves as well.
But it starts in the family.
Absolutely.
Can you tell me something about yours?
Mine, personally, yes, I was blessed with a feminist father who had no doubt that girls and boys are equal. I don't think it would have mattered to him. I don't think he ever saw me as less than my brother. And my mother went to medical school while we were children, where we were still very small, and and his trust in her, and her ability, and he practically dragged her to go register as a medical school student. So I think growing up seeing that, I think that's why I'm really bewildered now by men who are threatened by women's success. I think men who respect themselves respect women. It's really as simple as that. And my brother, equally supportive of his wife. And I'm blessed to have one boy and one girl, which means I can practice what I preach, at least at home, where I have control.
Many people, you're right, think that feminism, the whole concept of feminism is a Western import. So in order to be able to address that unfortunate assessment from folks, from our side, I guess you need to try to tap into those traditional institutions that we have in this country. Are you doing that?
Mm-hmm, absolutely. Our research is based on, it's academic activism that we do, so traditional forms of resistance. So trying to understand how it works in Oromo culture, for example, with the Sikh institutions, with the Adoye. Adoye is an institution of unmarried girls and the support they have for each other. So that's something we've adopted. And as setaweet, we call each other Adoye. It's my sister. And for us, it's strategic sisterhood. It doesn't mean we have to like all women, but we are concerned with safeguarding women across the board, and also supporting each other whenever we can. So everything, all our principles are completely Ethiopian. We've undertaken study into the feminist movement within the students' movement of the 70s and the 60s and the 70s, and really try to learn from what's come before us, looking into traditional systems like Ashenda. What's that about? Women's only spaces. What did the Ethiopian philosopher Zara Yacob talk about the rights of women way before anybody in the West talked about equality? So this idea, this argument that equality and justice are not Ethiopian, for me that's really worrying. If it's the word feminist you don't like, then substitute it with something else. But the idea that we stand for are universal, and they're definitely Ethiopian. We believe that. So
you are a private company, right? Well, why is that? I find
well, setaweet PLC. There's a PLC side to it. Setaweet, the movement, is much bigger than us, of course, and it's a movement, so nobody runs it. But setaweet PLC is the custodian of the movement, which means it's registered to do social enterprise work. So we undertake research, we undertake trainings, and it's the custodian of the movement in the sense that it hosts meetings. We have women's only circles that meet once a month, and we do open sessions. And because somebody has to administer all of this, we're registered as a business, as a social enterprise.
Why are you not an NGO? That's my question. As it should be, perhaps. I don't know.
Why should it be, though? I think, why should it be the work of NGOs to stand up for our rights? I think that's part of the problem of the way that rights work has been done in Ethiopia, and it left it really vulnerable to being attacked the way it was by the government a few years ago when the law passed. I don't think we ever considered the idea of making it an NGO. I think it should be my work and not necessarily the work of a Western-funded entity to bring about change. And the understanding of NGOs, particularly the Amharic Erdata Sachi Dirjit, is really loaded because it's not a charity organization. It's a rights-based organization. We work on rights, and we do that as a social enterprise.
How do you reach out to the ordinary Ethiopian out in the village? I mean, basically you're in research and training and so on, and it seemed to be limited to what happens in town.
Absolutely, and that's a criticism we fully take on. It's definitely urban-based. We'd even concede that it's Addis-based for now. Everything has to start somewhere, and we're only 4 years old. Our biggest kind of outreach methods are media. So we're really quite big on media, and social media penetrates every village now. That's by far our biggest tool. And second is the gender shops. It's a series of feminist trainings we have for schools, and our dream for that is that it will reach every village and every town, and not be limited to Addis. But we're always looking for ways in which to replicate what we do in other parts of the country, and it's definitely something that we're working on.
How soon would that be?
Watch the space. It will, it will depend. But definitely in the next 5-10 years, we're particularly engaging with universities. We've already made inroads with a few of the urban universities we have outside Ethiopia, because you do need a way in. You can't just show up and set up a setaweet office in X village.
We now have, of course, a new government, if you will, and 50% of the members of the cabinet are women.
Yes.
We have a female president. Mm-hmm. We do have a female chief justice. Mm-hmm. And head of the electoral board. What does it mean for your movement?
It's amazing for our movement. It's we can hardly believe it. It's representation is important in and by itself. Having a woman represent Ethiopia, the first head of state, the first female head of state in 122 years. It's amazing, something to be celebrated. Head of the election board. It's not only the fact that it's a woman, but that it's Birtukan Mideksa. It says a lot about democracy and human rights. So we're thrilled by that. The press secretary is a woman, not only a woman, but a feminist. The same with the deputy secretary. So we're incredibly thrilled. It's amazing to have women. And I've left the gender cabinet, the 50% women, gender equal cabinet for last, because I think it's actually incredibly significant. What this symbolizes, not just what it symbolizes, but what it means is critical mass of women who can make change. We've never had that in the history of Ethiopia. We're only the 6th country in the world to achieve this. It's incredibly meaningful. Yes, it's an act of political will by our prime minister. It's not something that any political party worked on. It's not an achievement of the women's movement. We can't really say that, but it's an incredible opportunity because it gives the chance to women to bring about real change. When you're 50% of anything, there's power to shift the dynamics. 1 or 2 women ministers we've had in the past, we've had up to 20% or 30%. They haven't really been able to tip the balance for equality. But when you have 50%, that's an incredible opportunity. And I really hope they'll work together. And they seem to, so far, to work together to bring about critical change, because representation...
Is that too early to say?
Well, for now, yes, but I think the beginning is important, and the first 100 days of the gender cabinet it's left us with a lot of hope. We see them interacting with each other. We see them being very responsive. And it's a time for optimism. It's a time that I never thought I've seen in my lifetime, or even in the lifetime of my children. And it's up to them to make it work for a better Ethiopia for women and men.
In what sense? I mean, you've said enough about that, but then do you think that we need more legislative work that should happen sooner?
Absolutely. In terms of legislation, very clear ideas. Domestic violence and gender-based violence needs a revised look. We don't have specific legislation against gender-based violence. It's treated just as a regular crime, and even the language of the criminal code, if you look at it, is very gender-blind. So definitely new laws, but even attention to how women and men fare in the regular ministries. So, for example, Ministry of Transport, we have a woman minister, and we would love for her to look into the rampant violence that happens in urban areas on public transportation under her jurisdiction. So these are like the kind of things that you hope people will start looking at now that we have women in key positions of power. Not to say men shouldn't have done it, men should do it, but we expect more from women ministers.
Well, thank you very much. And it was a pleasure having you on my show.
I enjoyed it. Thank you.